Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I am Eric Johansson, a teacher with LSAT Demon, and joining me this week, don't call it a comeback, Matt Dumont, returning to the LSAT Demon Daily podcast. Great to have you back, Matt.
Great to be back.
For those of you who don't know, Matt is one of the OGs of the LSAT Demon teaching crew, helped many of us get to -0 on the logic games. The logic games have been ripped away from you, but you're back teaching logical reasoning now, right?
It hurts my heart so much, but yes, no, I'm thrilled to be back. I'm back with the Demon now that my clerkship is over, and I'm going to be teaching logical reasoning and reading comp on Thursday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern, a new class called Jury Trial. We'll see how it goes. First one's tonight as of this recording.
Nice.
So the listeners will maybe get a little preview after the fact.
What's your elevator pitch on Jury Trial? Highly participatory, if your usual teaching style is anything to go off of.
In fact, highly participatory is in the plug. It is 100%. It's an advanced level, highly participatory class where people are going to come on the mic. They're going to talk about why they're fighting against this particular thing. They're going to get voted on by their peers. Their peers are going to render the verdict, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm going to issue my rulings. What? Sounds kind of fun.
Awesome. Well, this is what you have been building towards. You're donning the robes and stepping behind the bench. And you mentioned that you have just wrapped up your clerkship. And that was the reason that we wanted to bring you on. There's a lot that is out there in the ether about clerkships as something that law students aspire to, that sounds prestigious. We have this vague sense that, a clerkship is what you want to do if you want to get, the top job possible. So
sure.
Wanted to demystify a little bit and talk about the process and what actually it is to be a clerk. So maybe start with, where did you clerk?
So I clerked for Justice Houghton on the Supreme Court of Maryland. It is the highest level court in the state of Maryland, state level appellate court, of course. And we're what was called a court of certiorari. So when you have a case go against you, you have the right to appeal, whether that's civil or criminal. You can appeal by right. You can always have someone review it if you have an adverse outcome. That appeal might not be meritorious, that kind of stuff, but you can make your complaint towards the appellate court, the intermediate court. And this is pretty standard across most states and the federal government. Your circuit courts of appeal are the sort of version of that at the federal level. You have the right to appeal your case. Certiorari courts like the Supreme Court of the United States, like the Supreme Court of Maryland, like the Supreme Courts sort of throughout the United States at a state level are typically, you have to petition the court to take the case, and they will either say yes to that or no to that. Supreme Court of Maryland probably gets 1,000 petitions or more a year, both criminal and civil, and they grant somewhere between 30 and 60 of them total. And so when you consider
even more exclusive than law school,
when you consider, like, Maryland is not like an unpopulated state, but it's not exactly a huge state either.
Sure.
We have 6-7 million people, whatever it is. We have about 1 million cases a year that come through the Maryland judiciary. If you consider traffic offenses and jaywalking and like whatever else that you could end up in court for, there's like 1 million cases a year, and only like 30 of them get all the way to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court wants to do very specific cases that sort of speak to novel issues, new ideas that haven't been heard in the state before, new shifts towards ideas that have existed in the past, changing the trajectory of things based on new technology or new implications by society, new laws that come up when we interpret them for the first time. They really pick these specific cases that are going to have a much broader impact across an entire state, just like the federal government with the Supreme Court chooses very specific issues, and they tend to go, hey, there's a circuit court split on this, so we're going to decide that issue and make sure that the circuits are actually going in alignment on this particular thing. So the sort of like Supreme Courts of the United States and the Supreme Courts of states, they're very specific on their caseload. But because of that, you get to really get knee deep into the materials a lot more. You know, if you're on a trial court, you might have, 6 cases a day or 8 cases a day. If they're just like disposition after disposition, like that kind of stuff. District court dockets, hundreds of cases a day before one judge. And they're just like going through landlord tenant cases. They're going through it. Right.
Yeah. That's an important distinction. I'm glad you made that point. So I guess a caveat to this discussion is that your experience as a clerk could look very different depending on where you're clerking. Are you with a state Supreme Court? Are you with a trial court? Are you? Yeah. So different. Absolutely. But generally speaking, is there something that clerks do, or how would you summarize the clerk's job, maybe regardless of where it is, or does it really depend on what type of court you're working at?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend pretty significantly on what type of court you're working at, and whether it's state court versus federal court. But like as a broad strokes generalization, you serve at the pleasure of a judge and you do what they tell you. You're assisting them with nuanced legal problems. You're helping them solve. You're being a sounding board. You're being a task rabbit. You're at a trial level. A judge might be sitting on the bench in the middle of a trial, and there's an objection about a piece of evidence coming in, and it's a difficult decision. It's not something that, like the rules really clearly define. It might require the judge to step off the bench for half an hour or an hour, or have a completely separate motions hearing for the admissibility of something or not. Well, the clerk is going to be helping the judge prepare for that, wrestle with that, find cases on point from the jurisdiction that you're in, or potentially sister jurisdictions if they're sort of persuasive and helpful in that way. And that's the same thing that I did at the Supreme Court level. We had a case before us. My job was to take the briefs from the different parties, look at the facts of the case, look at what they're arguing the outcome should be because the law says X or the law says Y. And then I go in and do my own independent research and would find the applicable case law on my own. I would find sister jurisdiction case law if it made sense to go down that route, and then make a recommendation towards the judge saying like, I think that this party should win on this issue and why. I think this party should win on this other issue and why. And some cases are more simple, some cases are more complex. But that's, as like a generalization, you're helping the judge figure this stuff out.
But you're having, it sounds like, real substantive conversations with the judge and helping to inform their understanding of the case and inform their decision.
Yeah. And that, of course, depends on the judge's style. Some judges want to have that conversation in person. Some people want it written, and like so that they can synthesize it and sit with their own thoughts. So one of the judges that I interviewed with on the appellate court, the intermediate appellate court in Maryland, is notorious for, or noteworthy for, whatever. Notorious isn't a bad word. He's notorious for, before oral arguments, there's this circuit on the top level of the courthouse that his chambers are in, and he will grill the clerk for 2 to 3 hours as they walk this sort of like walking path circuit.
Wow.
To sort of like marshal his thoughts, marshal the clerk's thoughts, be prepared for oral argument. The notoriety comes from clerks report back in like their exit interviews that they wore out like 3 pairs of shoes with Judge Friedman. Like, that's how some judges work that way. They'll call you in for a meeting or they'll do that. My particular justice was much more like, I want you to write it down. I want you to synthesize your thoughts in a more formal way and provide it to me in what's called a bench memo. And so I would sit down, I would synthesize, here's the facts of the case from the record. Here's the sort of arguments from each side. And then I would go in and look at the different law that applies and sort of synthesize the facts to the law. Here's my outcome. And that bench memo could be 15 pages or it could be 50, depending on the complexity of the questions in the case.
And besides that writing for the bench memo, or maybe from that writing, sometimes you could actually be contributing to the written decision too, right?
Yes. Yeah. And again, like, that will vary based on the court you're in. When I was interning, I interned on for a federal judge. I also interned on the Supreme Court of Maryland. I wrote portions of opinions there. I wrote memoranda opinions that have now been upheld by the Fourth Circuit. Woo woo, nice. Which is weird to say, but it depends on the judge's style and it depends on what they want. But I would say, like, if you get involved in a positive way and you show that you have the work ethic and the ability to do so, your words are probably going to end up in an opinion, whether you might be drafting it specifically or not. As an intern, a little bit less likely. But of course, as a clerk, I drafted several opinions, both majority opinions and quite a few dissenting opinions. My judge was in the dissenting column quite a bit this term, at least for the stuff that I was assigned to. She wrote 3 majority opinions with my co-clerk. I only got to write 1, but I got to write 3 pretty cool dissents along the path as well. And so the bench memo is sort of like my thoughts before the argument. And then if the judge is writing an opinion or decides to write a dissent or concurrence, that's my starting point, right? I have already done all this research, and then we have a conversation and go, okay, so there's a lot of applicable stuff here, but I also need to flesh out this other area based on what the judge thinks. And then it's a drafting process going back and forth, because with opinion writing, you're essentially a ghostwriter. You're writing in the style of, you're presenting the argument from the perspective of the judge, and they might not agree with your take. And you have to kind of make that gear shift, which is a little interesting.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. You don't need to get into specifics, but did you find yourself writing on behalf of the judge and thinking to yourself, I don't agree with this, but this is the judge's take?
So with my clerkship, I was fortunate in that I agreed with the positions that my judge took, or she agreed with the positions I took, whatever. We came to agreements in a variety of things.
Sure.
I have previously, though, I interned and I wrote a bench memo for a thing, for a particular case for a different justice of the Supreme Court. And my recommendation was that we should essentially affirm this conviction for a variety of reasons. And they didn't satisfy the test that was relevant and legally controlling. And the justice said, you know what? I don't think the test is just. And so we're going to change the test. And I don't have the chutzpah to say that, right?
Yeah. You said, well, that was, you were an intern, so you were still in the middle of law school at that point, right?
Yeah. And I think as a clerk, I probably wouldn't have the chutzpah either to be like, maybe we should think about changing the law of Maryland. I made some recommendations towards those things, like, hey, we should think about policy here, and maybe there's some room for this. It's kind of very tempered language. But in this instance, the justice said, I want to change what the test is in Maryland. And so because of that, we're going to come out to a different outcome. And I had to get on board with that, even though it didn't initially track with my take on the case. That's my job, right? Like, my job is to help my judge reach their end result, their end goal. And it ended up being a fantastic experience. And I think a great opinion.
Yeah. I imagine, I mean, you start talking about these sorts of issues, I'm imagining myself in your place, I feel like I would be maybe more aware, for better or worse, of the importance of that writing than any other writing I've ever done in my life. Is that the experience?
It's very interesting to read case law that so I had the experience because of this previous internship and the fact that I helped write 2 majority opinions during that time. I had the very interesting and weird, surreal experience of having advocates draft briefs that cited to works and cited language that I had written 2 years ago. And like, that's wild. Like, I was in law school, like typing away at a computer in like a little cubby, right? And now I'm seeing advocates take those words and try to argue their perspective based on this previous thing. It is surreal and very heady, and the gravity of that was definitely overwhelming at times. Of like, I'm here for the people of Maryland. I'm here to help serve my judge and help serve justice. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to go into public service. It's one of the reasons why I'm very like, I'm not the firm type of person. That's just not my career path. And working for a judge and working in public interest and doing that kind of stuff was really, it felt like you take the oath for real in a very real way, where maybe you don't in other areas of legal practice.
Yeah. Is that why you wanted to do a clerkship?
For public service?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly one of the reasons. I wanted to serve in that way. I find it, helping a judge, come to conclusions that are legally just and morally valid and like this kind of stuff is important. It's also really important from my perspective for future advocates to see how the sausage is made. You're going to become a better advocate for having clerked, right? You're seeing how judges think. You're seeing how judges deliberate. You're seeing what's persuasive to them, what is not persuasive to them, what arguments are effective, what arguments are not. And you're helping craft responses to those kinds of things from what is supposed to be, I recognize is not always, but what is supposed to be a objective, like, here's what the law says outcome. And going through that process is going to make you a better writer. It's going to make you a better researcher. Those are, of course, the two, I think, most essential skills that you come out for your practice. Like, even if you're in trial attorney all the time, you have to write, you have to research, or else you're not going to have anything to say. So sitting at the feet of a judge, quote, is a great way to hone craft. It's a great way to learn. It's a great way to see how these things work. And after having written thousands of pages of legal analysis and have that work, gone over with a fine-tooth comb, not only by my co-clerk, but also by the judge who was I was working for, certainly made me a better writer. But also the service element is really important. I think it's a great idea to give back in that way if you can.
I guess we should mention there are, I think, for many, material benefits to clerking. Maybe not immediately, but probably the reason a lot of people look up to clerkship as something that they want to do is the doors that it opens and what it can lead to. It doesn't sound like that was your motivation, but what's your understanding? Sure, but not in the way that you said. You're not, looking to get some big law bonus because you clerked.
Sure.
But that, what's your understanding of the, like, the various reasons for wanting to clerk?
So I think there's definitely prestige involved. I mean, clerkships are talked about as being prestigious. They're presented as being prestigious. And I would argue that not all clerkships are identical. clerking for a local circuit court judge, in your local county is certainly great. And that could lead to, local connections. Judges know people. They have to. They know all the practitioners. They have to. And so I think that there's opportunity connections there. But that's not quite the same as the prestige of clerking for like a federal circuit court judge or a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Those kinds of doors, when you walk through them, open up a different kind of door in your career in a way that it's like having a giant, like the X Twitter, like the check mark next to your name.
Sure. Yeah.
It kind of feels like that. You have like law review during school is like a version of that. You get a check mark next to your name by people saying, yes, this person has a quality to them that we are willing to put our name behind. The same is true from clerking for judges. And so it'll open up doors. It'll open up connections. You might get a mentor out of it that's helpful for your career for the rest of their life, the rest of your career. But also, I mean, a lot of firms do look for clerks because, hey, we didn't have to pay for this person to go get a year of excellent legal writing and research training. Fantastic. We will now pay you X dollars as a signing bonus, and you come in with a year of seniority towards partnership that you wouldn't otherwise have. And so you're not penalized for, going and clerking for a year. Another benefit, and if for those people that are like public service oriented, clerkships allow you to defer for honors programs in the federal government. So like if you want to go to DOJ honors or you want to go to the FDIC for the in-house counsel honors, generally speaking, the federal government doesn't take entry-level lawyers. They're not going to take someone straight out of law school. That's just not how it works. It's 3-year requirement, practice elsewhere, do this kind of stuff. The one exception to that as a generalization is the honors program, which lets you come in either straight from law school if you have like a 4.0 at Yale, or straight after a 1 or 2 year clerkship. You can come in as an entry level before that 3-year time period. But the things that let you do that let you defer, are clerkships and things like 1-year fellowships, those kind of term limited type things. And so getting that kind of stuff helps you check the box. DOJ wants you to have clerkship experience. It's not a requirement, but they want it because they know what happens when you clerk. Firms want it. That's why they offer clerkship bonuses, $50,000, $100,000. You want to buy a house, go clerk for the Supreme Court. That clerkship bonus from there is $500,000 at some of these top firms, which is wild to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's quite a few benefits, I think, from the prestige level, that kind of stuff, perceived benefits at least. But it does depend very much so on what level you're clerking at.
Yeah, I'm sure. Would you say that also applies for different judges? Like there's obviously the different levels and the different types of judges you could clerk for, but do certain judges have reputations for, if you clerked for this one, that tells me something different than you clerked for this other judge, even if they're both on the Supreme Court of some state or elsewhere? Sure.
So there are judges that people are going to read their opinions when you read your textbooks because they wrote noteworthy opinions for whatever reason. Supreme Court, of course, every Supreme Court justice has written some sort of opinion that you're probably going to study. They're all prestigious. But circuit courts and even some district court federal judges and even some state level, like Supreme Court judges, justices, these kinds of things, some of them have written opinions that will show up in your textbooks because they are particularly persuasive or have been adopted in a variety of places. And that was the original opinion that sort of came up with this theory or whatever. And so, of course, there's some names on your resume, just like other names, or just like any other industry. You work for Disney, it opens up a lot of doors, right? Maybe not the same as working for like the local Fox News channel or ABC channel, whatever. The same, I think, is true. There are certainly judges that are going to open up more doors because they want to help open those doors, or because their, longevity in the career has garnered enough of a reputation. I would argue we had Judge Nazarian on the podcast a while ago. He's one of the appellate judges in Maryland, and he is very well known. He's a good example of someone who I think would open doors because he wants to help his clerks in that way, but also because everybody knows him. Not quite the same for all of the judges on the appellate court of Maryland.
Yeah. And we were privileged to have Judge Nazarian on the Thinking LSAT podcast. If you're interested, check it out. Episode 421, Behind the Bench with Judge Nazarian.
Great man.
Great insight into what it is to be a judge. So that was a great conversation. Cool. Well, take us back to maybe just the process of securing a clerkship. Like, you had an internship, but when it came to getting a clerkship, when does that process begin, and how does it begin?
Sure. So state level is a little bit different than feds, and I'll briefly cover the federal just because that makes sense, because it's relatively straightforward. Most judges adhere to it. Judges at the federal level typically follow the Oscar hiring schedule. Oscar, if you type like Oscar federal judges, it will take you to the website. After your 2L summer, during your 2L summer, after your 2L year, you can start to apply for federal clerkships. Before then, it's generally closed. You can sign into the program, you can upload your materials, you can even select which judges you want to, but they won't get your materials until the Oscar deadline, which is usually sometime in June, right? And so you have your entire first year of grades, you have your entire second year of grades, and then the floodgates open. Now, I will say that a lot of judges are hiring 2, 3, 4 years out. Wow. And so you might not be eligible to apply for stuff immediately after you graduate, because they might have, for instance, filled that at the federal level, which is why at, say, more intermediate ranked schools, whatever else, a lot of people do state clerkships before they go to the feds. They can do that sort of career path, because it's like, hey, all the Fed stuff that I was interested in doing near me was taken up. And so I applied for one a year after I graduated. I had to get something in the intermediate. And so I did an appellate clerkship, and then I went to the Fed district. That's a pretty common sort of path. State level, it varies wildly. And so like in Maryland, which I can speak to, the Supreme Court and most of the appellate judges start hiring in like January of your 2L year. They start taking in materials. They'll start having interviews as soon as they start getting qualified candidates, and they'll hire by March, right? They don't want to compete with the feds. They want to lock people down before the federal guidelines even open. And that's pretty common, I think, at state levels where they open those sort of things a little bit earlier, kind of like early admissions cycles.
I was gonna ask, does this mean that you are forced to make a decision between taking this potentially great state clerkship or saying, hey, I applied, or I want to apply for federal clerkship. Do I wait to see how I did there?
And if you do that, I will strongly suspect that your state clerkships will be filled by then.
Yeah.
And so you would potentially have to choose that path A, path B. Federal clerkships, I will say, like if you're at T14s, that kind of stuff, they have a little bit more access to opening those doors in a way that, for instance, mid-tier schools don't. So keep that in mind. But I think that there is some validity to that. It might be, I'm really interested in clerking federally. I want to clerk for sure. Well, if you take a clerkship with a judge and then you back out of it like 3 months later, you're going to make everyone unhappy. And it's very possible that that judge is going to call your future federal judge, and who knows what happens, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be very cautious.
Really careful about burning bridges.
Yep.
Seems like a small, well, you got, judges are doing this work for a lifetime, right? So they get to know each other and talk with each other.
They know everyone. Judges talk. So for the state side, it tends to be sooner, and they hire as they get qualified candidates. And so I applied for state stuff. I applied for federal things for after my state clerkship. I didn't end up going that route. I did not get offers, so I got some final interviews. And I'm going a different route, at least for now, with my career and my practice, which I'm certainly happy about. The 1 year of clerking was, I think, sufficient for me for now. I want to practice, right? And I want to get out there and be an advocate and that kind of stuff. And so for people that are considering doing 2 or 3 years of clerking, it is a long time, but there is a lot of value there. It depends on what you want to do.
Yeah. How long do most people clerk? A year, a couple years?
Yeah, I think usually a year, unless you're really, really gung ho about clerking, and like you could become a senior clerk, for instance, which you could stay there for 10 years if you wanted to.
Wow.
Or if you really want to, go towards the federal government, doing a state level and then a federal clerkship, 2 years, pretty common. If you want to go up the appellate chain in the federal government, you're looking probably more like 2-3 years minimum, because that's just what it takes. It might take you 2 district court judges to vouch for you in order to get you in the door at an appellate court or like a circuit court judge for the feds, unless you, of course, go to places like Chicago, Yale, Stanford, that have people that go straight to those clerkships out of law school. So,
yeah. For the more prestigious, quote unquote, clerkships, would you say that, you mentioned the likes of Chicago, Yale, would you say that those prestigious clerkships are drawing more exclusively from those top law schools?
The Supreme Court numbers don't lie, right? Like,
yeah.
They occasionally pick people from other schools, your Notre Dames, your Vanderbilts. Note that both of those are still pretty darn good schools, right? I think that there was like one person from Georgetown or 2 people from Georgetown. The vast majority of those clerks come from Yale, from Stanford, from Harvard, Penn, Chicago. And realistically, like, Harvard is a machine, because they have 500 people graduate from one of the best law schools in the country every year. That's more than Yale and Stanford combined. So, like, you put enough people out there, you're going to have some cream rise to the top, especially at such a good school.
What's the workload like? You looking at 9 to 5, punch your card, clock in and out?
Yeah, for the most part. I think that will depend. Federal, again, is a little bit different, because the workload, especially at federal trial courts, is so overburdened that the U.S. government is actually considering expanding the amount of judges. Holy crap.
Wow.
They are incredibly overburdened and at the federal district level. And so the work there is more like 8 to 6. And then as required. That was my workload, was 8:30 to 4:30, 8:30 to 5 most days. But there were certainly days that I worked till 10, and there were certainly days that I woke up at 6:30, got immediately to work at home, went into work, continued, did all that kind of stuff. That was few and far between, though. That was mainly when we were like circulating opinions, getting comments, getting feedback, which really required sort of like a lot of very quick movement on something. My day to day was regularly like 8:30 to 4:30, 8:30 to 5.
Gotcha. Sorry to backtrack. Going to getting a clerkship, how do you research like where to apply? Because I think about law school applications. We know there's 200 or so law schools, and you find the ones that are close to you, and it's not overly complicated to find a short list. But like, there's no U.S. News rankings for
judges.
for judges. So like, where are you going to? Is this just information that your law school has? Where are you going?
Yeah, I mean, CDO at your law school is certainly a place to start. The Career Development Office, they're going to have a lot of judges that they've worked with, that kind of stuff. I want to recommend a great way to start to even know whether you want to clerk is to intern while you're in school, like do it for credit, intern for a local judge and get some experience. It's going to be great experience for you. And it might lead to further connections. I got my Supreme Court clerkship absolutely in part because I showed up and did well on the interview with good writing samples and that kind of stuff. But the door was opened because I interned for a different justice, and that justice was like, hey, I'll call people on your behalf. And so he opened up doors to other justices on the Supreme Court. And that was absolutely very beneficial to me. And so interning is a great way to potentially find out whether you want to do the job in the first place, because you're going to get experience that's tangentially related. Your CDO is great. And I want to plug the Legal Accountability Project. It's a fantastic, fantastic organization, which they're trying to bring, especially to the federal clerkship, but they're doing more and more state stuff, especially with federal clerkships. They are doing what is essentially a centralized clerkship database that is countrywide and allows people who have clerked to write candid responses about clerking, their experience, the work environment, what the judge is like, all those kinds of things. And it's important because your CDO, if you're not at Yale, is going to be more local. Like my CDO knows Maryland and some DC, right? If I wanted to go to Indiana because I want to go back home or whatever, practice where you want to work, or go to law school where you want to practice. That's the right way to say that. But say you want to move somewhere, you want to go to Arizona because that's where your family is, and you came to Maryland because they gave you a great ride. Okay, well, my CDO is not going to have very much information about Arizona because no one does that. Legal Accountability Project is a fantastic resource towards that kind of information. It's only accessible to people who are seeking clerkships, and it has to be verified by the school that you're seeking a clerkship. And it's just a fantastic opportunity to find out sort of this democratized information that's candid and frankly tells you about workplace toxicity. Mm-hmm. Clerking is not always awesome. Judges are often, well, I shouldn't say often. There are many times that clerkships are toxic. I had several friends quit their clerkships this year because they were working for tyrants. And I'm fortunate that I didn't have that experience, but like close friends of mine working for like a local trial court judge were like, nope, I'm done. I'm out. The Supreme Court of Maryland removed a judge from the bench because of their mistreatment of clerks and their staff in part. They did some other crazy stuff too, but like that was part of it, was how they were mistreating their staff. And so LAP's mission is also to raise awareness for these kind of like workplace issues that do exist, because it's a work environment just like anywhere else. You deserve dignity, you deserve respect, you deserve not to be mistreated. Just because your person is a judge, like, wait a second, shouldn't they be more beholden to like treating people well? Unfortunately, that's not always the case.
Yeah. Sounds like an amazing project. So that's the Legal Accountability Project, kind of like a glass door for judicial clerkships. Is that fair to say?
It's absolutely fair to say. And Eliza Schatzman is the founder of it. And I think she was on the Thinking LSAT podcast as well. Yeah,
check out episode 418, Demystifying Judicial Clerkships with Eliza Schatzman. Great conversation about more about the project and that great work. Yeah, something that is useful to have in mind. Many people go into law school thinking about all the prestige and opportunities that will come with a judicial clerkship, and important to recognize that there's it's still a job and you have a boss.
Still a job, and you have
Yep.
a boss in a very close environment.
Yeah, I'm sure. You said you had a co-clerk, at least one? You were on a team of clerks?
Yeah. So at the Supreme Court level in Maryland, there are 2 clerks and a judicial assistant in the chambers along with the judge. So counting the judge, it's a team of 4.
Hmm.
But like, that's essentially who I lived and worked with for a year. And if there's butting of heads, it can be very close proximity, butting of heads. With a trial court judge locally, you might have one clerk and the judge, and that's it. Higher level federal type stuff, circuit courts of appeal and Supreme Court, they have 4 clerks, if I remember correctly. And then also, of course, their judicial staff. So
Sure. Well, Matt, this has been extremely helpful for me, at least, as I think about my own potential law school career ahead of me. Hopefully, this has just opened the eyes for some of our listeners as well. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about? Anything that I'm sure there's tons to talk about, and you have a bunch of experiences from your work as a clerk, but is there anything that we didn't talk about yet that you want listeners to know about?
I think I just want to sort of like sum up, if that's okay.
Please.
Of just saying, like, I think it's an incredible opportunity. I think it's an incredibly important opportunity because working for judges is going to make you a better advocate, but it might also open your eyes to the idea of being a judge yourself, going down that sort of public service career path. Many people are like, hey, I want to go to a firm, and that's great. Go do that. For me, that's not the path that I want to go down for a whole host of reasons. But I think that there's a lot of value towards having broader experiences, having more diversity in the clerkship world that can lead to more diversity in the judgeship world. And I just want to particularly highlight that I think these experiences are essential for a fair and just judiciary. And I just really want to encourage people to seek them out.
Do you want to be a judge?
It has crossed my mind.
Well, you just threw that in there, and that you talked about it's a good opportunity to see whether that might be. All right, I'll let you're continuing to ponder your future career plans. For now, you are going to. Oh yeah, well, you mentioned the work that you're going to do now. You're going to be a appellate level prosecutor, right? Just briefly what you're doing now as an attorney.
So by the time people hear this podcast, I will have started, but I will be starting this Monday for me. I'm going to be at the Baltimore City Office of the State's Attorney, which is local prosecutor's office for Baltimore City. And I'm going to be doing post-conviction work, which is a collateral appeal for people who have been convicted of major felonies. So the major felonies that you can think of, and you spend, we'll say, a longer amount of time in prison, you have the right to a fair trial. That it is so important. So I'm on the prosecutorial side of things, and I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to seek justice. And there are going to be cases that come to me where there was a problem at the trial level, and that person's right to a fair trial under the Constitution was infringed upon, and they're making a valid claim. And I'm going to be the first one to say, yes, I agree, right? This person deserves a new trial. A lot of times, the error that they are complaining of is not substantial or is not real. And then you were convicted by a jury of your peers for that crime. And so it will be my role to advocate on behalf of the people of the city of Baltimore and the state's position in those cases, which will be to say, unfortunately, sir or ma'am, no, you do not deserve a new trial because of the ineffectiveness of your counsel. Your counsel was great. So that's the position that I'm going to be starting on Monday.
Exciting
Stuff.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time. I appreciate your coming on and helping to further demystify this world of judicial clerkships.
Glad to.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I look forward to the day when maybe someday you have that perfect 5-star rating as a judge on the Legal Accountability Project.
Glassdoor.
Yeah, only positive reviews. No tyrant here.
No tyrant.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
My pleasure.
Email daily@lsatdemon.com if you'd like to ask us a question or share some LSAT or law school admissions news. Thanks for listening.